The warship drifted like a dying leviathan above the scarred moon. Its hull split open in 3 places, atmosphere bleeding into the void through emergency containment fields that flickered with desperate blue light. Inside the Vorrath's pride, the corridors glowed with bioluminescent strips that pulsed in rhythm with the failing reactor, casting shadows that danced across walls of living metal. The Zephyrians moved through the chaos with 6 limbs each, their carapace bodies clicking in distress as drones buzzed overhead, attempting repairs that collapsed faster than they could be implemented. Marcus Holt stood at the airlock threshold, his single duffel bag containing everything the Galactic Coalition deemed necessary for a maintenance recruit, and watched the alien engineers argue in their rhythmic language of sound, like rain on metal sheets. One of them noticed him, gestured with 4 arms in what might have been dismissal or disgust, and returned to shouting at a holographic display showing reactor temperatures climbing into critical ranges. The plasma core chamber was a cathedral of failure when Marcus first entered it, the air thick with ozone and the acrid smell of overheated circuitry. Zephyrian engineers surrounded the massive containment sphere, their quantum tools humming as they worked with mathematical precision that yielded nothing but error messages and failed attempts. Marcus stood in the shadows for 20 minutes, saying nothing, his eyes tracing the conduit paths and energy flow patterns while the aliens consulted their AI assistants and recalculated equations that couldn't account for the warped metal and improvised patches left over from the ambush. When he finally stepped forward and requested access to a welding station, the laughter came in clicks and whistles. "Your kind still fastens things with threaded metal," the lead engineer said, mandibles spreading, in what Marcus had learned was their version of a smile. "Earth is barely past combustion engines." Marcus didn't argue. He pulled the handheld arc welder from his kit human-made, heavy with settings that ranged from delicate to destructive, and approached the stabilizer array they'd written off as unsalvageable. 6 hours later, when the stabilizers hummed back to life and the ship stopped its slow spiral toward the moon's gravity well, the corridor had gone silent except for the renewed thrum of systems coming online. The schematics appeared in his quarters as holographic projections that filled the cramped space with ghostly blue wireframes of the entire ship. Marcus had requested them 3 times before the commander reluctantly granted access, and now he stood surrounded by rotating images of power systems, life support networks, and weapons arrays while eating a ration bar that tasted like cardboard mixed with synthetic proteins. His fingers moved through the projections, zooming in on the coolant conduits that threaded through the ship's spine like arteries. Something was wrong, not broken, but fundamentally flawed in the design itself. The redundancy was missing, the backup systems routed through the same vulnerable junction points that a single hit could destroy. He'd seen this before on Earth, in the early orbital stations before humanity learned that space demanded multiple failsafes because equipment didn't just malfunction, it catastrophically failed at the worst possible moments. When he brought it to the command deck, the Zephyrian officers listened with the patience of adults, humoring a child until Marcus walked to their tactical display and showed them exactly how the next hit to their starboard quarter would cascade through those poorly routed conduits and turn their reactor into a bomb. The simulation ran, the ship exploded in holographic fire. The commander's 6 eyes blinked in sequence, and suddenly Marcus had authorization to reroute every major system on the ship. He worked in the lower decks where the ship's bones were exposed, where the bioluminescent lighting gave way to emergency strips that barely illuminated the crawl spaces between decks. The Zephyrians avoided these spaces too cramped for their 6-limbed bodies, too inefficient for their precise tools that required specific angles and calibrated approaches. Marcus moved through them like he'd been born in tight spaces, his smaller frame an advantage for the first time since boarding. He slept in 4-hour bursts on a makeshift cot beside the reactor core, the radiation levels monitored by a scanner he'd modified to scream if they approached dangerous thresholds. The alien crew began to notice him during shift changes. This lone human emerging from access tunnels covered in coolant fluid and metal shavings, heading to the fabrication bay to turn scrap into components that somehow fit into systems they'd designed. "He treats the ship like it's alive," a young Zephyrian engineer whispered to her supervisor, watching through a maintenance drone's camera as Marcus ran his hand along a damaged power conduit, feeling for vibrations that no sensor could measure, listening for sounds that their advanced hearing couldn't distinguish from normal operation. The supervisor watched too, unable to explain how the human knew which systems needed attention before the AI flagged them. The message arrived during what passed for night. On military time, the Dominion warfleet had altered course, arriving in 3 standard days instead of the expected 5. The command deck erupted in controlled panic. Officers moving with urgent precision, while their leader calculated impossible math. Repairs projected at 7 days. Combat readiness requiring at minimum 6, and time available totaling 72 hours. Marcus heard the announcement through the ship's communication system, while shoulder-deep in a junction box, rerouting power feeds to restore capacity to the shield generators. He didn't stop working. In the command center, Zephyrian engineers mobilized with their quantum processors and collaborative AI networks, dividing tasks with algorithmic efficiency, while Marcus descended deeper into the ship's infrastructure, into spaces where he worked alone with tools that would have seemed primitive in any other context. His welder threw sparks in the darkness. His hands fabricated brackets from hull plating, fashioned connectors from broken drone parts, and rebuilt power distribution networks using principles of redundancy and improvisation that no Zephyrian textbook contained. The commander watched through surveillance feeds, unable to look away from this strange primate who sang softly while working old Earth melodies that predated spaceflight, work songs from an era when humans built machines with their hands because they had no other choice. When the forward sensor array came back online, an array the Zephyrians had catalogued as requiring complete replacement and 3 weeks in a proper shipyard, the alien engineers gathered around their displays in confusion. The human had somehow salvaged it, rerouting damaged sections and creating new pathways through what should have been dead circuits. Marcus emerged from the access tunnel looking like he'd fought a small war, his uniform torn, a burn across his forearm that he'd wrapped in synthskin, and exhaustion making his movements slow but deliberate. The targeting systems need calibration, he said to no one in particular, then headed to the mess hall for his first real meal in 16 hours. Behind him, the chief engineer stared at the sensor data flowing across her screen and tried to calculate how one human had accomplished in 2 days what her entire team couldn't have done in 2 weeks. The numbers didn't balance. The methods didn't match any protocol in their databases, and yet the systems worked, humming with a stability that felt almost organic. The Dominion fleet arrived early, tearing into rail space with the fury of wounded pride, seeking revenge. Alarms shrieked through the Vorrath's pride as the crew scrambled to battle stations, while systems that should have been ready collapsed under the stress of combat initialization. Shield generators flickered and died. The main drive stuttered, losing power as the plasma conduits couldn't handle the surge demand. On the command deck, the Zephyrian officers watched their carefully calculated plans disintegrate in real time, while enemy warships locked targeting solutions on their crippled vessel. Marcus was in the engine bay when the power failed. When the lights went dark and the reactor's hum dropped to a dying whisper, he didn't wait for orders. His hands moved across the manual override console, a backup system the Zephyrians barely acknowledged because their AI handled everything, and began rerouting power through paths that violated every safety protocol in their databases. The feedback loop he created was unstable, dangerous, a solution that pushed the reactor beyond rated capacity by feeding excess energy back into itself in a cascade that could either restart the core or turn the ship into expanding debris. The reactor ignited with a roar that shook the hull. Power flooded through the ship on pathways Marcus had rebuilt with his own hands, following routes he'd improvised and redundancies he'd installed because humans understood that machines failed and survival meant having 3 backup plans for every critical system. The Vorrath's pride came alive under human hands, its engines burning with intensity that surprised even its creators, shields snapping into place with power reserves the Zephyrians didn't know existed. Marcus staggered onto the command deck, his face streaked with plasma, ash and sweat, his hands still trembling from manually cycling the reactor restart. The Zephyrian commander turned to him, all 6 eyes wide with something between shock and reverence. "How did you override our AI safety protocols? How did you know the reactor would accept that cascade pattern?" Marcus leaned against a console, catching his breath, and gave the only answer that made sense to him. "You build machines to think for you. We build them to survive with us. On Earth, if your equipment fails, you die. So we make sure it doesn't fail. And when it does, we make it work anyway." The battle raged in the void outside. enemy fire painting space with deadly light, while the Vorrath's pride moved with a grace it hadn't possessed even before the ambush. The human improvisations, the redundant power systems, the rerouted conduits, the jury-rigged components fashioned from scrapper formed beyond specifications, adapting to combat stress in ways the original designers never anticipated. Marcus stood at the engineering station, monitoring systems he'd rebuilt, while the Zephyrian weapons officers fired with precision enabled by the sensors he'd restored. When the final enemy ship broke formation and fled, when the immediate threat dissolved into scattered retreat vectors, the command deck remained silent, except for the steady hum of systems working in perfect harmony. The commander approached Marcus slowly, lowered herself on all 6 limbs in a gesture no human had ever witnessed from a Zephyrian officer, and spoke in the human's language, though her accent turned the words strange. "You are no maintenance worker. You are a warship builder. You are what we should fear." Marcus shook his head, too tired for grand statements, too exhausted to explain the centuries of human history that had taught his species to see problems not as equations to solve, but as challenges to overcome through sheer determination and creative stubbornness. On Earth, we call that being human. We break things, we fix things, and we make sure they work when everything says they shouldn't. He left the command deck and returned to the engine bay, to the spaces he'd claimed through hours of solitary labor, and stood in the warm glow of the reactor core system that should have been dead, running better than new because someone had cared enough to rebuild it by hand. The ship around him thrummed like a living thing, every system connected through pathways of improvisation and ingenuity, and Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The message went out 3 days later, transmitted on encrypted channels to the Galactic Coalition headquarters. The Zephyrian commander stood before the holocron, her military bearing perfect, her words chosen with care. Recommendation regarding human integration into galactic fleet operations. Humans should not be assigned as maintenance workers or engineering assistants. They should be designated as fleet architects and emergency system specialists. What they lack in theoretical knowledge, they compensate with practical intuition that exceeds our computational models. The human Marcus Holt rebuilt this warship faster and better than our best engineers could have, using methods that appear primitive but produce results our technology cannot match. Humanity does not build machines, they create survivors. The transmission ended. The Vorrath's pride continued its patrol, its engines singing with power, its systems optimized by human hands, and deep in its core, Marcus Holt worked on the next improvement, because machines always needed maintenance, ships always needed care, and humans never stopped building.